The air inside the azure plate was different. It wasn't just the air conditioning, which was so perfectly quiet you couldn't feel it, but the air itself. It felt filtered, expensive, and cool against the skin. The restaurant was a study in minimalist design, with walls the color of a stormy sea, dark wood tables that gleamed under tiny, focused spotlights, and not a single picture on the walls. The only art was the food, arranged on plates with the precision of a surgeon, and the people, who were dressed in shades of black, cream, and charcoal. They moved with a quiet confidence, as if they owned the very space they occupied. In a way, they did. Every table was occupied by the city's elite. A man in a tailored suit, his watch catching the light as he gestured, was explaining a complex business deal to his dinner companion. At another table, a woman with a diamond necklace resting on her collarbone laughed softly, a sound as polished as her silverware. They spoke of art auctions, stock portfolios, and weekend trips to private islands. Their voices were a low, steady hum, a soundtrack to a life of ease and privilege. To them, the staff was almost invisible, a silent, efficient team of shadows that ensured their water. Glasses were never empty, and their every need was anticipated before it was even spoken. And then there was Clara. She moved through this world of quiet wealth like a ghost, but a very necessary one. Her black uniform was simple, her shoes comfortable for the long hours she spent on her feet. She carried a heavy tray of champagne flutes, the delicate glasses not clinking because she had learned how to walk with a rhythm that was both fast and steady. Her face was a mask of polite neutrality, a skill she had perfected over years of serving people who rarely looked her in the eye. She would approach a table, her voice soft and professional. "Good evening. Would you care for some more water, sir?" The man would barely glance up, just a slight nod, and she would pour, her movements fluid and practiced. Then she would fade back into the background, a part of the restaurant's expensive ambiance, but behind the neutral mask, Clara's mind was a world away. As she refilled a glass, she wasn't thinking about the man's conversation about hedge funds. She was thinking about a melody that had been stuck in her head all day, a complex tune with a soaring chorus. She hummed it softly to herself as she walked back towards the kitchen, a tiny, secret rebellion in the heart of the silence. She thought about the worn-out guitar case sitting under her bed in her small apartment, and the notebook filled with lyrics she wrote late at night after her shifts. These were her real treasures, not the diamond necklaces or expensive watches. They were her dreams, tucked away safely, waiting for a chance to see the light of day. The work was physically demanding. The plates were heavy, the hours were long, and the smile she had to maintain felt sometimes like it was carved into her face. She had a knot in her shoulder that had been there for a week, a dull ache that was a constant reminder of her double shifts. But she was good at her job. She was fast, efficient, and she had a way of remembering people's orders, even the most complicated ones. It was a different kind of intelligence, a practical skill that kept her employed and paid the bills. Tonight, the restaurant was even more charged with a special kind of energy. They were hosting an artist showcase, an open mic event for the diners' entertainment. A small stage had been set up near the bar, with a microphone and a single stool. The idea was to provide some quaint live music to complement the expensive food and wine. Clara watched as the sound technician checked the microphone, his movements quick and efficient. She knew some of her coworkers were planning to perform. They were talented, but they were amateurs, hobbyists. The diners would probably enjoy it in a detached sort of way. They would clap politely, maybe even compliment the manager on the lovely ambiance, and then go back to their conversations about money and power. Clara didn't plan to perform. Her music was too personal, too raw for this crowd. She couldn't imagine standing on that stage with all those eyes on her, their expressions a mixture of boredom and mild curiosity. Her songs were about her life, about the struggle, the hope, the quiet desperation of living in a world that felt so out of reach. They were about the ache in her shoulder and the melody in her head. They were not background music for a dinner party. As the evening went on, the restaurant filled up even more. The low hum of conversations grew louder, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, truffle oil, and money. Clara weaved through the tables, her tray held high, her mind a million miles away. She was a professional, a ghost in the machine, a waitress in a world that didn't see her. But she was also a dreamer, with a song in her heart and a story to tell. And she had no idea that her life was about to change, that in just a few hours, the invisible ghost would become the center of everyone's attention. The stage was waiting, and so was her moment. The first performer of the evening was a young man from the local university, a cellist with a perfectly manicured beard and an expensive-looking instrument. He played a piece by batch, and he played it well. The notes were clean, precise, and technically flawless. It was the kind of music that was perfect for this setting, sophisticated, classical, and utterly without any raw emotion. It was background music, a sonic wallpaper that didn't dare to distract from the conversations about stock options and real estate deals. When he finished, he gave a modest bow, and the room responded with a polite, restrained applause. It was the kind of clapping that says, "Well done, you fulfilled your purpose as tonight's quaint entertainment." No one was truly moved. No one was surprised. Then, the host, a man with a slicked-back haircut and a suit that was just a little too shiny, walked back onto the small stage near the bar. He clapped his hands together with a practiced enthusiasm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Wasn't that just wonderful?" He boomed, his voice a little too loud for the intimate space. "A true talent." He paused, letting the compliment hang in the air, a reward for the diner's good taste in choosing this restaurant. "And now," he continued, a sly, almost conspiratorial smile spreading across his face, "we have something very special for you. A real treat from right here in our own Azure Plate family. Please give a warm welcome to one of our wonderful waitresses, Clara." The name hung in the air for a moment, followed by a beat of confused silence. Then a ripple of murmurs and quiet chuckles spread through the dining room like a contagion. Heads turned, not towards the stage, but scanning the waitstaff, trying to place the name. A woman at a table near the front, wearing a silk dress that probably cost more than Clara's monthly rent, let out a soft, audible scoff. She leaned towards her dinner companion, a man with a jaw so sharp it could cut glass, and whispered behind her hand, "The waitress? This ought to be amusing." He chuckled, taking a sip of his wine, his eyes already glazing over with a look of bored anticipation. The sentiment was almost unanimous. They were the city's elite, accustomed to concerts in grand halls and famous artists in exclusive venues. The idea of being serenaded by their server was a novelty, a slightly absurd one. Like being asked to admire the chef's dishwashing skills in the shadows near the kitchen. Clara felt a jolt, as if someone had pressed a live wire to her skin. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm that had nothing to do with the calm classical music from moments before. She had agreed to this on a whim, a desperate, last-minute decision made after the host had announced there was an open slot. She hadn't really thought they would call her name. She hadn't prepared. She was still in her work uniform, a black apron tied snugly around her waist. Its pockets holding a crumpled order pad and a pen, she saw her manager give her a small, encouraging nod from across the room. It was now or never. Taking a deep, shaky breath that did little to calm her nerves, she stepped out from the shadows and began the long walk towards the stage. The distance, which she normally covered in a few seconds with a tray full of drinks, suddenly seemed like a mile. Every step felt heavy, as if she were walking through thick mud. The low hum of the restaurant, which was usually just background noise to her, now seemed to roar in her ears. She could feel every eye in the room on her, their gazes like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. She saw the smirks, the raised eyebrows, the looks of pity and condescension. They saw the apron, the tired look in her eyes, the humble status of her job. They had already judged her, and they had found her wanting. She kept her eyes fixed on the small stage, on the single microphone standing like a lonely sentinel under the spotlight. She tried to block out the faces, the whispers, the feeling of being an exhibit in a zoo. She tried to remember the melody she had been humming earlier, the one that lived in her heart. But her mind was a blank, a terrifying void of panic. What song was she going to sing? She couldn't remember. All she could think about was the sea of faces, all waiting for her to fail, to provide them with a brief, awkward anecdote for their next dinner party. As she finally reached the stage and climbed the 2 small steps, she felt a fresh wave of self-consciousness. The stage was meant for performers, for artists, for people who belonged in the spotlight. She felt like an imposter. She reached for the microphone stand, her hands trembling slightly. She tried to adjust the height, her fingers fumbling with the screw. It was a small, clumsy movement, but in the silence of the room it felt like a major catastrophe. She heard a few more snickers from the crowd. They saw her unsteady hands and took it as confirmation of their assumptions. This was going to be a disaster. They settled back in their seats, a few of them even taking slow, deliberate sips of their wine. Ready to endure the performance, Clara stood there for a moment, her hands still on the microphone stand, her back to the audience. She closed her eyes, shutting out the judgmental stares, the smirks, the entire world of the azure plate. She took another deep breath, this one slower and more deliberate. She could feel the slight vibration of the air conditioning, the cool metal of the microphone stand under her fingertips. She thought about her small apartment, about the worn-out guitar under her bed. She thought about the notebook filled with lyrics, about the late nights spent writing songs about her life, about her dreams, about her struggles. This music was not for them. It was for her. It was the one thing in her life that was truly hers, a voice that no one could silence. A sense of calm began to wash over her, a quiet determination that pushed back the panic. The trembling in her hands subsided. She slowly turned to face the room, her eyes still closed for a moment longer. When she opened them, she didn't look at the smirking faces or the expensive clothes. She looked past them as if they weren't even there. She was no longer a waitress on a stage. She was a musician about to share a piece of her soul. And the room, which had been so full of noise and judgment just moments before, fell silent in anticipation of a sound they never could have expected. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the expensive air conditioning. The silence that had fallen over the diners of the azure plate was not one of respect but of anticipation. It was the quiet of an audience waiting for a punchline they already knew, the hush before a predictable, slightly awkward performance. They were settled in their seats, a few with faint, condescending smiles still playing on their lips. They saw the young woman in the simple black uniform, the slight tremble in her hands as she had adjusted the microphone and they had already written her off. She was a temporary diversion, a curiosity, nothing more. Clara stood there, her eyes now open and fixed on a point just above their heads, looking at the dark, stormy-colored wall. She wasn't seeing the expensive art or the minimalist design. She was seeing something else entirely. She took one final, slow breath, and in that breath, she seemed to shed something invisible. The slight slump in her shoulders from a long day's work straightened. The weary look in her eyes, the one she tried so hard to hide, was replaced by a fierce, quiet intensity. The waitress was gone, and then she opened her mouth to sing. The first note that came out was not what anyone expected. It wasn't hesitant or quiet. It wasn't the thin, reedy voice they had braced themselves for. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very core of the earth, a soulful, powerful note that was both raw and incredibly controlled. It cut through the sterile, filtered air of the restaurant like a bolt of lightning, instantly silencing the hum of their self-satisfied conversations. It was a voice that held stories, a voice that had lived. The entire room fell silent. Not the polite, waiting silence of before, but a stunned, absolute silence. A man who was in the middle of telling a complicated story about a merger froze, his mouth half open. A woman reaching for her wine glass stopped, her hand hovering in mid-air. Every head turned towards the stage, every eye now fixed on the woman they had so easily dismissed. The smirks were gone, wiped clean from their faces as if they had never been there. The song she sang was a haunting blues ballad, a melody that felt both old and new. It was a song about unseen struggles and hidden strength, about being a ghost in a world of the living. The lyrics were simple, but they painted a vivid picture of a life lived in the shadows. of dreams tucked away in a drawer, of a quiet fire that refused to be extinguished. She sang about long days and tired feet, about the ache of wanting something more, about the beauty that can be found in the struggle. As she sang, Clara was no longer just standing on a small stage in a fancy restaurant. She was somewhere else, lost in the music. Her eyes were closed now, her face a canvas of raw, authentic emotion. When she sang of being unseen, a look of profound sadness crossed her features, and for a second, she looked just like the tired waitress they had ignored all night. But when the chorus swelled, singing of a hidden strength that was waiting for its moment, her expression transformed. Her chin lifted, a look of fierce determination in her eyes. She wasn't just performing a song. She was living it, reliving every moment that had led her to this stage. The diners, who moments before were ready to endure a mediocre performance, were now completely captivated. They were not just listening. They were feeling. The woman in the silk dress, the one who had whispered that this would be amusing, now had a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning respect. She was no longer seeing a waitress. She was seeing an artist, a woman with a depth and a passion she had never bothered to imagine. The man with the sharp jaw had put his wine glass down, his bored expression replaced by one of intense focus. He was leaning forward in his seat, as if trying to get closer to the sound. To understand the source of this unexpected power, the song began to build, the verses giving way to a powerful, soaring chorus. Clara's voice, which had started strong, seemed to grow even more potent, filling every corner of the room. It was a voice that demanded to be heard, a voice that refused to be ignored. The notes hung in the air, shimmering with an emotion that was almost tangible. The room, which had been a showcase of expensive decor and privileged detachment, was now a sacred space, a place where a single, powerful voice was telling a universal story of hope and resilience. The chef had peeked out of the kitchen door, his usual stern expression replaced by one of utter disbelief. He had worked with Clara for over a year, and he had never seen this side of her. He had only ever seen her as a reliable, quiet employee. Now, he was seeing the soul of the woman he had only ever known in a professional capacity. The other waitstaff had stopped what they were doing, standing in the shadows, watching their coworker with a newfound sense of awe. They were all part of this invisible world, and to see one of their own step into the light so brilliantly was a powerful, inspiring sight. As the song reached its climax, Clara's voice soared to a breathtaking high note, a sound that was filled with all the pain, all the hope, and all the strength she had been holding inside for so long. It was a note that seemed to hold the weight of every unseen dream, every unheard voice. It was a declaration, a proclamation, a testament to the power of the human spirit. And when she let that final note fade into a perfect, profound silence, the room remained still. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all frozen in the moment, caught in the spell she had woven. The smirks, the condescension, the judgment, it had all been blown away, replaced by a shared, humbling experience of being truly and completely moved. The invisible waitress had not just sung a song. She had bared her soul, and in doing so had touched the souls of everyone in the room. The final note hung in the air, a perfect, shimmering thread of sound that seemed to tie the entire room together. Then it dissolved into a silence that was heavier and more profound than the one that had come before it. It was a sacred, reverent silence, the kind that follows a truly great and unexpected event. For 3 full seconds, no one in the azure plate moved. A man with a fork halfway to his mouth remained frozen, his eyes wide with a look of utter disbelief. A woman who had been checking her phone under the table now stared at the stage, her device forgotten and dark in her hand. The air, which had been so full of quiet confidence and muted judgment just moments ago, was now thick with a shared, humbling awe. It was a man sitting alone at the bar who broke the spell. He was older, with a lined face and a grizzled look, a well-known music critic who was famous for his harsh reviews and his intolerance for mediocrity. He had been scowling into his whiskey when Clara began to sing. Now his scowl was gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. He slowly put his glass down, the sound a soft click in the immense quiet. Then he brought his hands together in a single, loud clap. The sound was sharp and clear, a gunshot in the stillness. That single clap was all it took. It was like a dam breaking. Another person joined in, then another, and suddenly the entire restaurant erupted. It wasn't the polite, obligatory applause they had given the cellist. This was a raw, powerful, deafening ovation. The sound was a physical force, a wave of noise that washed over the room. People were on their feet, cheering and whistling. A man in a tailored suit was banging his fist on his table in rhythm with the clapping. The woman in the silk dress, the one who had smirked and whispered that this would be amusing, was now on her feet, clapping so hard her palms must have been stinging, tears welling in her eyes. They were not just applauding a performance. They were reacting to a transformation, a revelation. They were cheering for the invisible girl who had just shown them a universe of passion and pain they never knew existed on the stage. Clara seemed to shrink under the weight of all that attention. The fierce, powerful singer who had commanded the room just seconds ago was gone, replaced by the slightly overwhelmed waitress. A deep blush spread from her neck to her cheeks, and she gave a small, awkward bow, her eyes fixed on the floor. She felt exposed, as if she had just taken off her skin and shown them all the raw, trembling nerves underneath. The roar of the crowd was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had dreamed of a moment like this, but the reality of it was overwhelming. She quickly mumbled a thank you into the microphone, her voice barely audible above the noise, and then practically fled the stage. The walk back towards the kitchen was the complete opposite of her walk to it. This time, when eyes turned towards her, they were not filled with condescension or pity. They were filled with respect, admiration, and a newfound curiosity. As she passed the table where the woman in the silk dress was sitting, the woman reached out and gently touched her arm. "That was incredible," she said, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "Absolutely incredible." Clara just nodded, unable to find the words, and hurried on, her heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The world felt different, sharper, more real. She pushed through the swinging doors that led to the kitchen, and the noise from the dining room was instantly replaced by a different kind of chaos. The clatter of pots and pans, the shouts of the chefs, the heat from the stoves. It was a familiar world, a world she understood. But tonight, even this world had changed. As she entered, the frantic activity seemed to slow down, then stop altogether. The chefs, the dishwashers, her fellow servers, they all stopped what they were doing and turned to look at her. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, and then the kitchen erupted in its own way. A young server, who had started the same day as her, rushed forward and wrapped her in a tight hug. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" she squealed. "Where did that come from?" "I had no idea." Another one of her coworkers patted her on the back, a huge grin on his face. "You blew them away out there." Absolutely blew them away. Even the head chef, a stern, intimidating man who rarely spoke a word to her beyond "Table 4 needs their food," came out of his office. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then gave a slow, deliberate nod of respect. That nod meant more to Clara than all the cheering in the other room. It was validation from the people she worked with every day. The people who knew her as just another person trying to make a living. Clara was still trying to catch her breath, her mind reeling from the whiplash of the last half hour when she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was the owner of the restaurant, a man who was usually as polished and distant as the silverware on his tables. She had worked for him for 2 years, and he had never once initiated a conversation with her that wasn't a correction or a command. "Clara," he said, his voice serious. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes held a look of profound shock and something else, something like dawning respect. "We need to talk." "In my office?" Her heart sank. Maybe she had broken some rule. Maybe performing was against policy. She followed him into his small, tidy office, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the noise of the kitchen. He gestured for her to sit. but she remained standing, too nervous to relax. He leaned against his desk, studying her. "I've owned this restaurant for 15 years, he said, his voice quiet. "I have seen famous musicians, celebrities, politicians. I have seen it all. And I have never, in all my years, seen a room react like that." He paused, letting his words sink in. "That voice, that song. Where did that come from?" Clara finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "It's just something I do," she said. "It's mine." The owner nodded slowly, as if understanding something for the first time. "Well, it's too good to be just yours," he said. "It's something people need to hear." He stood up straight, a business decision clearly forming in his mind. "I want you to perform here. Every Friday and Saturday night, we'll build you a proper stage in the corner. We'll pay you a professional fee. You'll be a featured artist, not a waitress who sings on her break." Clara just stared at him, her mouth open in disbelief. This was it. This was the dream she had tucked away, the one she barely allowed herself to think about. It was being handed to her, not by a record label or a talent scout, but by the man who had only ever seen her as a means to an end. She had not just sung a song. She had changed her own life. As she walked out of his office a few minutes later, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The other servers looked at her with a new kind of awe. The diners she passed on her way to finish her side work looked at her with a new kind of recognition. She was still just a girl in a black uniform, wiping down tables and collecting dirty plates, but everything was different. The applause had faded, but its echo remained, a promise of a new beginning, a new life that was waiting for her just beyond the last table she had to clear. The world didn't stop turning just because Clara's had been knocked off its axis. There were still tables to be wiped down and dirty plates to be carried back to the kitchen. The last few diners were lingering over their coffee, their conversations now quieter, more thoughtful. As she moved through the dining room, clearing the last of the dinner service, the atmosphere had changed completely. The invisible barrier between the staff and the patrons had dissolved. Now, when they looked at her, they didn't see a uniform. They saw the woman with the voice that had reached into their chests and stirred. Something they had forgotten was there. A man who had been quietly eating his meal alone waved her over. He was older, with kind eyes and a gentle face. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft. "I just wanted to say, thank you. That was a very long time ago for me, what you sang about. Thank you for reminding me." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She could only manage a small nod and a whispered, "You're welcome." Before moving on, his words a warm weight in her heart. Another couple stopped her on her way to the kitchen, not to complain about the bill, but to ask if she had a CD they could buy. She had to laugh, a real, genuine laugh, and tell them she didn't. Not yet. The walk home that night was different from any other walk she had ever taken. The city lights, which usually just meant the end of a long, tiring day, seemed to sparkle with a new meaning. The cool night air felt crisp and clean against her skin, washing away the lingering scent of truffle oil and expensive perfume. She was still wearing her worn-out shoes, and her shoulders still ached from carrying heavy trays, but she felt like she was floating. The roar of the applause was still echoing in her ears, not as a loud noise, but as a quiet, steady hum of validation. It was a sound that said, "We see you. We hear you." She reached her small apartment, the one with the peeling paint on the windowsill and the squeaky floorboard by the door. It was the same apartment she had always lived in, but tonight it felt different. It felt less like a place to hide from the world and more like a home where a dream was being born. She didn't even bother to turn on the lights. She walked straight to her bedroom and knelt down on the floor, pulling out the old, worn-out guitar case from under her bed. She ran her fingers over the scratches and scuffs, each one a memory of a late-night practice session, a moment of doubt, a burst of inspiration. This guitar wasn't just an instrument. It was her oldest and most loyal friend. She opened the case and lifted the guitar into her lap. It felt heavier than she remembered, more real. She then reached for the notebook filled with her lyrics, the one she kept tucked away in her nightstand. She flipped through the pages, her fingers tracing the words she had written in moments of joy, sadness, and frustration. These songs were her diary, her private thoughts set to music. She had always been afraid to share them, afraid that they weren't good enough, afraid that no one would understand. But tonight, something had shifted. The owner's words echoed in her mind. It's something people need to hear. Maybe he was right. Maybe her small, private world of songs had a place in the big, wide world after all. The next few days were a blur. The owner of the Azure Plate was true to his word. He had a small team come in and build a proper, raised stage in the corner of the dining room, away from the main flow of traffic but visible from every table. They installed a professional sound system and a single, elegant spotlight. He told her she could choose her own songs, that she could be herself. He wasn't looking for background music anymore. He was looking for an artist. Clara spent every free moment preparing. She practiced until her fingers were sore, choosing the songs that meant the most to her, the ones that told her story. She was no longer just singing for herself in her small apartment. She was getting ready to share her soul with the world, or at least with the small part of the world that dined at the Azure Plate. She was nervous, but it was a different kind of nervousness than before. It wasn't the fear of being judged or laughed at. It was the nervous energy of an artist before a show, the thrilling, terrifying anticipation of putting your heart on display. Finally, the first Friday night arrived. Clara arrived at the restaurant not as a waitress, but as a performer. She wore a simple, elegant dress, a far cry from her usual black uniform. As she walked towards the small stage, she saw that the restaurant was full. The faces in the crowd were different from the ones she was used to. Yes, some of the regular diners were there, but there were new faces too. People who had heard about the singing waitress and had come just to see her perform. They looked at her with anticipation, not condescension. They were there to listen. She sat on the stool, the spotlight warm on her face. She looked out at the sea of faces, and for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She took a deep breath, the same way she had done on that life-changing night, and began to play. The first notes of her guitar filled the room, and then her voice, clear and strong, joined in. The room fell silent, just as it had before. But this time, the silence was not one of shock, but of reverence. They were there for her. As she sang, she saw the woman in the silk dress in the audience, her eyes closed, a peaceful smile on her face. She saw the owner standing by the bar, his arms crossed, a look of pride on his face. She saw the grizzled music critic, sitting at the same table as before, his notebook open, a look of intense concentration on his face. She was no longer a ghost in their world. She was the center of it. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a musician. The dream that she had tucked away under her bed was now real, and the sound of her own voice, singing her own songs, was the most beautiful sound in the world. The crowd had smirked at first, but now they were leaning in, captivated, blown away by the quiet strength of a woman who had finally found her voice and was no longer afraid to use it.